Find your seats. We're going to get rolling on our next speaker. I'm going to pick on my mom back there, April Miller. Taking your seat. Just kidding, thanks for being here. Love you, Mom. Okay. Alrighty. I first heard the name Rafe Pomerance in 2018 when Losing Earth, the decade we almost stopped climate change, was published by the New York Times Magazine. That in-depth piece, later expanded into the book Losing Earth, highlights Rafe's career as a climate activist, portraying him as a pivotal and often unsung hero in the early fight against global warming. Little did I know that many years later I would find myself on a Zoom call with Rafe. When we first met virtually through our Go North Alliance meetings, I didn't immediately put two and two together that I was speaking with a living legend in the climate movement. Despite all he has accomplished, Rafe is incredibly humble about his work, and I have learned a tremendous amount from him throughout the years. And over the last 3 years, he has served as our facilitator of the Go North Alliance, which is a coalition working toward securing a northern alternative for border H from Parsons to Davis. And it has truly been a pleasure to work alongside him. And today, I have the honor of introducing Rafe to all of you at our forward meal. And I have been joking to Rafe that he has the longest Wikipedia page of anybody I have ever personally met, so this might take a minute. Rafe's environmental career began back in 1972 when he started working on urban environmental issues. In 1973, he launched the National Clean Air Coalition and served as its coordinator for 5 years, building early momentum for stronger air pollution laws. By 1975, Rafe joined Friends of the Earth to lobby for clean air reforms, and he eventually led that organization as its president into the early 1980s. In the late 1980s, Rafe emerged as a key figure in international climate policy. At the 1988 World Conference on the Changing Atmosphere, often dubbed the Woodstock for climate change, he was among the first to propose a concrete global emissions goal, a 20% reduction in carbon output by the year 2000. That ambitious target, once considered bold, soon became an early benchmark for climate action worldwide. In 1993, Rafe moved into government service when President Bill Clinton appointed him Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Environment and Development. In that capacity, he helped shape U.S. climate policy and contributed to the international negotiations that would eventually lead to the Kyoto Protocol on climate change. Today, he continues to lend his expertise as a distinguished senior Arctic policy fellow at the Woodwell Climate Research Center, one of the world's leading climate change research institutions. Rafe, thank you for your tireless work and for paving the way for all of us in the climate movement. Your legacy is an inspiration to me personally and to all of us who are continuing to fight for a just and livable future. Everybody please join me in giving a warm welcome to Rafe Pomerance.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yes? Do I have to shout anymore? No. The one key, I'm not sure what I have left to say after that introduction. Because if you look at the title of my talk, it's How Did the Movement Emerge on Climate and Where Are We Today, right? So Olivia and I agreed on that title very quickly. And little did I know it would take me about 5 days of back and forth across that span of time to try to come up with something reasonable about it. I just want to say that when I helped to form the Urban Environment Conference, 1972, you mentioned that. My partner in that is here, my wife Lenore. We weren't married at the time, and that organization helped bring us together. So I'll come back to something we've done just very recently in my talk. I wanted to begin first to recognize my friends of recent years in the Go North Alliance. To keep ourselves company, we meet every Wednesday at 10 a.m. And we've been doing it for quite some time now. And when I come here to Blackwater and I look out across the canyon, and I think the Department of Highways still thinks that they could build a 4 or 5 lane road just over the hillside of one of the most magnificent places in the country. You have to ask yourself, what are they thinking? And so all my friends are here. I'm glad we're together. The second thing I wanted to say about that is that, well, my work on climate change, I know what it was. The first environmental issue that I got started on back in the early 70s was highway policy. Some of you may be around who remember Richard Nixon and John Volpe, his Secretary of Treasury, that proposed a massive reform to the highway program, where local governments could trade in highway segments for urban mass transit, because there were so many controversial projects being built through urban centers that there was a big movement to change that. And actually Nixon and Volpe, his Secretary of Transportation, was from Massachusetts, embraced that idea. Well, after working on that for many years and having a place out there in Germany Valley where we now live, I learned of famous highway project, not an urban project, mind you, Corridor H. But do you all know in those days where the highway department wanted to put it? Because it doesn't seem that they've learned anything.
By Seneca Rocks.
What?
By Seneca Rocks.
Yes. Wasn't called Seneca Rocks, it was so long ago, it was called Mouth of Seneca. And they happened to run into the Bowden Fish Hatchery in their construction. You may remember that. The legacy is there because the road ends right there. Well, why does it end there? Because Robert Byrd put the kibosh on it because he had appropriated the money for the fish hatchery. And my last story on this is a meeting I had with the staff of Jennings Randolph. We all remember Senator Randolph, right? What was his job in the Congress? Chairman of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And who has that job now? Shelley Moore Capito, not to be forgotten. So his staff, I remember we got a meeting together with his staff and the head of the Appalachian Regional Commission, whose name I forget. All I remember, it was a shock to me, was Randolph's staff, the chief of staff, lambasting the head of the Appalachian Regional Commission for thinking of this route. He said, "This area is gold. What are you doing?" I'd never heard anything from this guy's mouth like this before. Anyway, that's my last Corridor H story. Now, what? Now get into the fate of the planet. They're related. Well, the first thing I wanted to say is a word about today, this week. What happened this week? A week ago. It's called Hurricane Melissa, the most powerful storm ever to hit the landfall in the Atlantic Basin. The most powerful storm ever. Well, why is that? Because hurricanes are becoming more powerful. Their intensity is going up because the water, primarily because ocean waters in the Caribbean are warming. So we had massive destruction in Jamaica, Cuba, and north. So to remind us of what's at stake, there was an event this week. And then last night I was sitting in the dining room and I picked up my monthly copy of the Tucker County Observer. Now what could be the relationship between the two? Well, you read up here, it's the killing waters. The story of next week is the 40th anniversary of Hurricane Juan, which landed and got stuck over the mountains to the south and destroyed numerous valleys, villages, and towns in this area, including where we are. We're fortunately well out of the floodplain. But I thought, there it is, look at that, 40, because in last year, of course, in North Carolina and so on, but storms are becoming more intense, particularly hurricanes. And I wanted to think, if that storm that made landfall at 185 miles per hour, if there hadn't been this sort of weather system pushing it east, and it had continued to track north, it would have run right into Mar-a-Lago. Wouldn't that have been terrible? At 185 miles an hour. Can you think of anything worse? No. Okay, so, but that's of the moment. I wanted to, the slide's already up there. Good. This slide, the most important slide on the planet. How about that? What is it? It's a concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over time, measured at Mauna Loa, the volcano in Hawaii, the so-called Keeling curve, set up by scientists, I think in 1958, David Keeling, Roger Revelle. And there you can see our fate is right represented in that graph, because it tells you that we are rapidly changing the composition of the atmosphere, which means we're rapidly changing the energy balance on Earth. The last 10 years have been the warmest on record. Last year was the warmest to date. And one can only expect it to continue to warm with all those consequences as that curve continues to go up. Because we're building too many data centers. No, that was supposed to be, I'm not sure it was a joke or a serious comment, but I suppose the relevance of it is that we have our head in the sands when we're considering massive commitments to fossil fuel combustion when we have this problem for civilization on our doorstep. Warn me on time, okay? Yeah, that's a good idea. While we still have it, water. My trek on climate change began with the issue of tall stacks in the Ohio Valley. Can you believe that? How could that possibly be connected? Well, the reason it's connected is that from 1973 to 77, I was the coordinator of something called the National Clean Air Coalition. That was a national coalition fighting to preserve the integrity and improve the Clean Air Act of 1970. It was quite a struggle, went on for 4 years, dozens of hearings. I was a lobbyist at the time, learning my way around Capitol Hill. So by the time we finished in 77, the issue of acid rain had come onto the table. Not been solved in those amendments, no provisions directly addressing acid rain, which was, impacting the lakes and rivers of the Northeast particularly, but additional geographies as well. So my job after the amendments were done, I decided, well, Rafe, you got to figure out how you're going to deal with acid rain now. So I start to do research on this, and I'm reading through this EPA report on the environmental impacts of coal. And there in that report are 2 paragraphs, or maybe 2 sentences, says, environmental impacts of coal will include warming the planet. Right there. And I shouted out in my office. I shouted, seriously, oh my God, this is the whole banana. That's a good quote. It made the New York Times magazine. It has its own headline. And so I haven't forgotten it. One of my colleagues heard me. She came in and said, what is this? So the next day she comes back with an article from the Rocky Mountain News, quoting Gordon MacDonald, very famous geophysicist, on the same problem. He had just presented a major paper on the impacts of rising carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel combustion, primarily. And Gordon had his offices in DC. I went out to see him, and we began a partnership that lasted many years to go around briefing policymakers, members of the Senate, members of the House, congressional staff, people in the executive branch. And I'm going to spill this any moment. It's dangerous, waving my hands around. So, what happens? Nobody knows anything about this issue. State of the planet, fate of the planet. Does anybody in Washington know anything about this? No. Well, I mean anybody in Washington. There are some villages of scientists who know and study this. But nobody in a policy-making capacity knows anything about this. I'm talking about the executive branch, Capitol Hill, even the media, nothing. Empty room, I call it. So Gordon and I, wonderful guy, began this trek around D.C. Fortunately, he liked to eat, drink wine, carry on. So we had one French restaurant we used to go to repeatedly that kept our relationship on track. And we kept at it. And two of the briefings we did, wait, I'm going to run out of time here. How much time have I got? Oh, 20 minutes. I'm doing okay. I was trying to think of how do I do 15 minutes for the past and 15 minutes for the future. We did several briefings. A couple of them I'll remark on. One was with Phil Shabakoff, who was a writer for the New York Times. Remember that Gordon had just written this peer-reviewed paper on the environmental and planetary impacts of carbon dioxide emissions. All the modeling you could ask for. So we go in there. I knew Shabakoff from various other issues. I remember this meeting at the New York Times. This is in 1979. I still remember. Not that much, but that one. So we sit there with Phil for, I don't know, an hour or two. He takes it all in. And he writes a story. And this story tells you where we were in the issue. The story appeared in the New York Times on a Saturday on page B29. Now, if you've ever heard of the record burial of a story, that's it. Saturday, B29 in the New York Times. How many people get to B29 on a Saturday? Not too many. Well, anyway, that was one I remember. Another couple of briefings we met with the President's science advisor, Frank Press. He trotted out all his senior scientists. Gordon does the briefing. After the briefing, Press decides he wants a study. He calls up the fellow who was the head of the GFDL, the Global Physics Dynamic Lab in Princeton. I forget, names are moving around there. A fellow named Jules Charney from MIT is tasked to lead a National Academy study requested by the President's science advisor. That study comes out later in '79 and says, we have looked at everything. We've looked at everything. And the way the planet's going to end up when we double carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a warming of between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees centigrade. So I think the pre-industrial level was 280. We're well on our way. We may have gone up 50. Oh, we lost that other slide. If we go back, I think we're, what's 50% on top of 280? 420, right? So at 420 parts per million, we're halfway to doubling. And what are we now? We're right about there. So we're halfway to this goal that the geophysical community would have thought, this is impossible. We cannot do this to ourselves. But there we are. And we're well on our way. And we're actually accelerating. So this Charney report, there's a great description of it in that New York Times report when they put it together. It ends up having a big effect on the debate and understanding because it's first-rate science. Basic consensus, double CO2, 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. No doubt about it. The same consensus exists today. You know, minuscule differences. Things haven't changed. The basic science is there despite the proclamations of President Trump that there's something fishy here, that it doesn't make any sense. That's the Mar-a-Lago report. But no, I mean, seriously, I'll get back to this, but denialism is a threat to the fate of the planet. And denialism has been around a long time, contradicting what the Charney report said, and that companies like ExxonMobil knew that it was true, told themselves, etc. The other briefing we did was with Gus Speth, who was chairman of the President's Council on Environmental Quality. And Gus said to Gordon, he said, look, I can't do anything with this unless you write me a report. And a few days later, back comes a report drafted by Gordon, Roger Revelle, David Keeling, and George Woodwell, 4 very famous climate scientists. Same story right there. Gus distributes the report. He tries to change the Carter administration policy. He succeeds. But more importantly, he goes off to establish the World Resources Institute, which is now the preeminent international global environmental group. I just learned the other day has 2,500 people and so many offices around the world. Gus isn't there anymore, but Gus was a key player. And that was our other big briefing at the time, as I recall, or successful with implications. From there, I'm just going to take us forward in the early days of this to how then we turned that into some congressional hearings in 1986 and 88. Those are the big hearings that broke the thing loose. To keep up with the title of my talk, how did this get going? Because remember, did I say this, that the room was empty? There was nobody there in these early days. In the NGO community, in the political community, there was nobody knew anything about this. So everything we did was brand new, and people would sort of get started and get going, right? And one of the things we did was, Gus, we got this tip from one of the Senate staff, Curtis Moore, who had agreed, based on our persuasion, to hold a hearing in '85 with Senator Durnberger. That was one of the first key hearings, Republican from Minnesota. He has a hearing, but he comes out, he said, look, Durnberger isn't going to continue with this. You got to find a horse. This is language on the Hill, horse. He says, Chafee, John Chafee, you may remember him, is holding a meeting in about 2 weeks to figure out what his environmental priorities are, okay? And so he says, you better show up. So I talked to my boss at the time. Gus had hired me to join him at WRI. I said, Gus, we got to go to this meeting. And so we go. Gus then speaks up in this big meeting with all the environmental community, who again are not on top of this issue yet. Says, Senator, I suggest you do these hearings on climate change. It's really important. Take it up. And Chafee says, I'll do it. Right there, he says, I'll do it. Well, that was one of the most important exchanges in the whole game when Chafee said, I'll do it. So we go to work with Chafee to structure these hearings that occurred on June 10th and 11th, 1986. If you want to have some great reading, go back and find those hearings. And I'll just say a word about the opening panel. It's crucial. The opening panel was 3 witnesses. Bob Watson from NASA on the ozone layer. If you remember, there was a big discovery back then, the hole in the ozone layer. Everybody remember the hole in the ozone layer? Yes, sir? You do? Okay. Bob Watson, from NASA, who was studying, was a stratospheric chemist. Second witness, Sherry Rowland, the Nobel Prize winner on the ozone depletion issue. Third witness, Jim Hansen. We all know who Jim Hansen is, right? The most famous climate scientist of them all. And this hearing is startling because it puts together the ozone depletion issue with the climate issue, the warming and the hole in the ozone layer. How? Because human beings had created this hole the size of North America over Antarctica. How did that work? But it made credible the climate issue, which was also a global impact of human activity. Well, this first panel was so successful, we got front page coverage in the Washington Post and the New York Times. Boom. Boom, boom, boom. That opened the issue up in my book. That was the start, right there, those 2 days. The next day got front page coverage as well from a second set of witnesses. I'll mention then another hearing that occurred 2 years later. Senator Tim Wirth, somebody we had gotten interested in the issue. Wirth walks out of a briefing, I remember, by the Stockholm Environmental Institute. He says, I was up there, it's right out of the Senate lunchroom, and he says, I'm going to hold a hearing. I happen to be standing outside, being a good lobbyist, and I'm going to hold a hearing. And I say to his staff guy, David Harwood, I say, David. And David said, who are we going to put up for witnesses? Wirth wants to do a hearing. Does he know what, How about calling Jim Hansen, I say. So he calls Hansen. Harwood does this. He calls him back and says, do you know what Hansen's going to say? Hansen's going to say that the warming has begun. He has the data to show that global temperatures now exceed natural variability. Well, this was brand new. Nobody had ever claimed this. Hansen, a very courageous guy, willing to come forward to testify, head of a NASA lab in New York City called the Goddard Institute for Space Studies. So that hearing occurs in July of '88. It's hot. There's drought, there's heat, there's fires. Perfect backdrop for the hearing. And Hansen proclaims that indeed the temperature of the Earth has risen above natural variability. Well, this story also brought the headlines. Huge coverage all over the world, all over the world. And Hansen took a lot of flack from his colleagues in the scientific community. It was interesting. Stood his ground, and he turned out to be completely on the mark. Then that Goddard Institute for Space Studies keeps a track of the global temperature record. So they had it nailed month by month. They had all the data. So at this point, I'm just going to stop with this part of the talk. If I have any time left? I do? How many? 15, okay. So this is the first half of the story, right? If you look at the title of the talk, it says, how did this thing get going? Think about those hearings. Think about them. Front page coverage, perfect science, total response from everybody. How can this be? And actually, Olivia referred, then shortly after that, Hansen goes to this meeting in Toronto and makes a speech where this is an international meeting where he calls for a 20% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions by 2000. A very ambitious goal, but it was a goal nevertheless. It was the first quantification of a target of reductions for carbon dioxide. That's what Tim Wirth did, and he continued his career on this in the Senate for years. Hearings, legislation, the whole deal. And but by this time, if you recall, I referred, I think, to the empty room. Nobody knew anything about this. No longer the case. There it was. It's out there for everybody. Sets of hearings, front page coverage. That's the beginning. Let's call it a decade. But it took all that time to get the front page coverage that blew everything up in my book. And it wasn't long after that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed, a big international assessment body. And not so long after that, they called for a global treaty, which was negotiated under the George H.W. Bush administration and ratified by the Senate in 1992. There's an argument over whether the Bush administration should have been more ambitious and called explicitly for emission reductions. But John Sununu, who was chief of staff at the time, wouldn't have any of it. It may or may not have a good thing because the treaty was agreed in the Senate, the ratification, which takes two, unanimously. Can you imagine anything like that happening now? Not possible. And that was in '92. Okay. So I'll stop there for this first half and just make a few remarks about things that happened between then and this portion of my talk about going forward. I have a very big idea to share with you at that point. It's only 5 words long. Now you figure out what they would be. But just a few things that happened in the meantime. As Levia mentioned, I served 6 years as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. I was a climate negotiator. I led the U.S. delegation to the first Conference of the Parties in 2 weeks, 30th Conference of the Parties coming up. That's how long we've been going with the diplomacy. That meeting was in Berlin. You remember, my interlocutor as head of the German host delegation was Angela Merkel. No kidding. Minister of Environment. Long before she never called me when she became chancellor, I have to say, after that. I was very disappointed, but that's the way it goes. At that meeting, we agreed, whether questionably, to agree to a new negotiation of a protocol that would actually commit to emission reductions. And that protocol to the Framework Convention was known as the Kyoto Protocol. If you're interested, you get to Lincoln Center really fast. There's a play there called Kyoto going on right now. It's very well done. Our family was up there the other day. First started in England, but it was a play based on the whole negotiation. A couple of other remarks during this sort of period, just a few things I remember. It was the disaster of some of the policy initiatives that we took. During Clinton-Gore, it turned out they were good policies, but they provoked political reaction. One was known as the BTU tax. Remember the BTU proposal? Well, the BTU tax works just like a carbon tax, but it's not called that. And the idea that the economists, of course, supported very strongly was that the most efficient way to reduce emissions was to price them. And that was the beauty of the BTU tax. It was also its political demise because the Republicans jumped on it and killed it. And it also then proceeded to cost Democrats in the next congressional election because taxes are so, as we know, politically difficult, to say the least. This happened again under Obama with his so-called cap and trade proposal, if you remember. Once again, it passed the House, went down a drain in the Senate, if I recall correctly. But was again used politically because the cap and trade system works by raising energy prices or carbon emission prices, which in turn create disincentives for their use, but also can be made into very difficult politics. I'll just say a word connecting that. If you look at Joe Biden's monumental achievement, short-lived, but the Inflation Reduction Act, there are no taxes in it. It's kind of subsidies and mandates and the like. Because until you have a bipartisan tax proposal, it's very difficult to see how it happens. Another event occurred along the way that we had some success was because in climate policy, technological innovation is at the center of solutions, was the establishment of ARPA-E. Anybody heard of that? It's called the Advanced Research Projects Administration Energy, modeled on DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects. And we managed to get a guy named, Senator named Jeff Bingaman from New Mexico, was chairman of the Energy Committee, very sympathetic, very capable, got behind it. We worked with him to make it happen. And that was another highlight of that period. I'll just mention the other big thing that lives till today is denialism. Denialism is the phenomenon of denying science, claiming it's phony, claiming it doesn't exist, continuing to call into question the basic idea of the problem. And that lives till today, because I would claim that Donald Trump's language comes out of the denialist movement. If ExxonMobil had stuck to its science, we might not be here. That if the energy companies had stuck to the science and been honest about it, we might not have the massive denialist movement that still exists mostly in the Republican Party, I'd say, but in many is used by many corporations still to diminish possibilities. How does a president of the United States, leave aside, twice pull us out of the Paris Agreement, claim that it's all a fiction, when there's no such case? None. That. And yet here we are. And I would say that is a byproduct of denialism, which came out of some scientists and others and PR people who made this kind of like tobacco and cigarettes. Who kind of made this up. And most of it happened in the 1990s, but it is sustained. And one of the most perverse events of the whole debate is the denialist element. Okay. So, what about today? I want to get to this big idea. maybe we ought to go on to another slide here. Get bored with that one. This is just a slide of the temperature trends in West Virginia, which show about a 1 degree centigrade warming over the last, I don't know, century. But you can see it's picking up. Anyway, the temperatures in the state are recorded. The trends are visible. Let's look at the next one. This is actually more, I don't have the right up-to-date slides, but they show a trends that are measured here in Canaan Valley of both temperature and snowfall over the years. And I wish I had one. I tried to get it right up to date because maybe it all changed, but there you are. Keep an eye on the trends here because they reflect what's going on, or they may reflect what's going on globally. All right, so what's the big idea? The big idea my colleagues and I are working on is something called establishing an upper limit for sea level rise. We're talking about the future now. What could we do? And our idea is to establish a second metric in the climate system. We have one metric in the global treaties, a global temperature limit of 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees centigrade. That's what was agreed at the Paris Accord. That's the one thing people know. Its limitation is it doesn't directly speak to impacts. So it's kind of weaker than it might be politically. And it hasn't driven enough action by nations, by everybody, to get the job done. So our idea is to set a second metric, an upper limit to sea level rise, and require the world to achieve that. I mean, that's the idea. And the reason is that sea level rise is a formidable impact happening now, going to accelerate, become massive, and potentially catastrophic in the not too distant future if we don't act in a big way. The sea level rise is well understood, it's measured, it's happening. And so our idea is to put before the world a new idea. And now, what have we got? Something else here? Okay, this is just another comment on the Trump. What has Trump meant to all of this? I think that, what's that big line is the data sets that have been taken down. The destruction of scientific data, the institutions is massive. Who knows how we'll recover? That slide is an indicator of it. So, the idea we have is to create this upper limit. And I think we'll go on here. Okay, Greenland. Recall Trump, he wanted to buy Greenland, didn't he? Annex it or something like that. The trouble is, Greenland's value is keeping the ice sheet intact because it's so far north, right? And Greenland is shrinking. It's unraveling. You could see the curve, right? So, bad idea for the United States to own Greenland, because then we're going to look like we're responsible for the melting of the ice sheet, which will raise sea level rise if it all goes 24 feet. 24 feet. And Greenland and Antarctica, which is now shrinking, are the two largest sources of sea level rise. So these ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica present a catastrophic possibility if we continue on our way. In the early days of this, people said, we don't know what's going to happen to Antarctica. It's so solid, it'll never melt. Scientists were not that clear. This is a possibility. Well, now Antarctica is shrinking. Greenland is shrinking. And unless we stop that, which is a massive task, we face a catastrophic outcome in the amount of sea level rise. That is kind of out there now. So our idea is, by putting this upper limit to sea level rise on the international agenda, that we can focus attention on the fate of the ice sheets, the fate of all the low-lying places in the world, population centers, and everything else, where their fate is at stake in what we do about climate change. So we'll see. Now, how are we going to do this? This is not so easy. We've been at it a while. It's not like taking over the front pages. Is there another slide? This explains it. You see, the 3 lines there are different emission scenarios, okay? I believe, right? Yeah. And the colors indicate the amount of sea level rise you get under each scenario. The higher the emission scenario, the more sea level rise. And the big red block up at the top, that's when the ice sheets start to go, when you get this massive amount of sea level rise over time. So our idea is to say, hey, we should be establishing a goal that's along the lines of the blue line, the lowest possible rate of sea level rise. It's impossible to stop altogether because we've heated up the planet so much that it could take a long time for all the ice to melt to come into equilibrium with whatever the temperature is. Now, let me just conclude with the 5-word idea that puts all this together. See what you think. Will it sell? In 2026, the United States has announced that it will host the G20 meeting. We all know what that meeting is. It's all the world's largest, biggest powers that come together annually to talk about whatever they determine. Well, the Trump administration has announced that that meeting will be in Miami. Well, right now, Miami has a lifetime left because of sea level rise. And our idea is to use the fact that this G20 meeting is happening in Miami to create a drumbeat around this issue of the upper limit. So we've come up with, at the moment, a one-liner, which is save Miami, save the world. Well, people like it so far. I even heard a slight murmur here. That's pretty good. If I get a murmur out of you, I'll go home happy. Well, the interesting thing about that phrase is that in order to save Miami, you have to zero out global emissions rapidly. Okay? However, if you do that, you happen to save the rest of the world. So on the one hand, if you want to save Miami, you have to save the rest of the world. Or if you save the rest of the world, you happen to save Miami. That's our one-liner. We'll see how I'll report back next year, tell you if it goes anywhere. And by that time, we'll be closer to the G20. So that's my talk, past and future. Maybe a question? Do we have a little time? Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
So about 15 years ago,
You want a mic? I can't hear you.
About 15 years
Good,
ago,
good. Yeah.
the Navy came out with a statement that their biggest threat to national security is climate change, and that if we don't stop it, we got to rebuild all of our Navy because it's flooding the Navy, the ports, everything. If you go to Norfolk, right? My daughter's in the Navy. It's been 15 years. She's out of Norfolk right now. Go to Norfolk today, you'll see building after building after building along the coast that has been abandoned, and they're building them farther inland.
Building them farther inland.
They're building them farther inland.
Right, they're anticipating sea level rise.
Well,
That's what the Navy's job is.
They had a storm down in Norfolk 2 weeks ago. They popped up on a Sunday afternoon like that created a huge havoc at Norfolk. My daughter she's in leadership.
What was it happened?
A storm.
Pop-up
storm.
Yeah.
On
Well,
Sunday afternoon, just put the whole town at off.
I'm hoping that Abigail Spanberger, assuming she wins, might be interested in this upper limit idea, because any governor can take this on as a policy initiative, assuming their state is vulnerable. Well, Virginia has a massive ocean coastline, the Chesapeake Bay, the Potomac. So any governor, Virginia, Massachusetts, whatever, could embrace this idea. I think of it as a leadership idea. I'm waiting for them to run to us. Nobody's come through the door.
Has been taken down from the Navy website. by the way.
And what's that?
That statement has been taken down from the Navy website.
Oh, of course. Yeah, more questions. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Do you think some of the climate denial group are actually more focused on different outcomes, and they're using climate denial to accomplish like consolidation of well, through the disasters and the destabilization, the forced migration, and the economic devastation that's going to happen from this? That they're going to use it to their advantage as like a consolidation of power towards like a feudal white Christian ethno state, at least in America. It seems like that's what maybe is going on. I'm just curious about the correlation between all that. Like they're using this as a political outcome, and I don't think that these people in power are totally idiots. Like they must recognize the science.
What's he asking? I don't know. I can't fucking hear him.
Say all that again.
One more time. One more time.
Do you think that the climate deniers that are the ones crafting this, like the PR firms and the super wealthy, I guess oil and gas and coal barons, that they obviously recognize the science and recognize that it's going to be a race to the bottom through the destabilization of the world, and they're using it to their own outcomes, basically to create a feudal white Christian ethno state in America?
Ooh.
Say yes.
Big question.
Yeah, big question. I'm going to change the topic. That's too big for me. Anything is possible, right, with these characters? My wife, Lenore, and I were having this conversation about the future the other day. She's a psychotherapist, and she was at a conference in Baltimore where a therapist has written a book. His name is John Gorman, about climate change and anxiety. And he gave a big lecture on this, about what's going on internally with people. You know, should we have children? People have all kinds of anxieties about the future, which one can say are reasonable, but there it is. It's kind of become a phenomenon of emotional life for some, and worth paying a lot of attention to. And I know for myself, my hardest audience has been my grandchildren. That's where it gets toughest, to talk to them. I took them all to this play in Kyoto at Lincoln Center to try to start a conversation. I think it will help. And but it's very tough. It's very tough. And real. Okay. Anything else? One more.
Yeah. What do you believe is the best way for regular people like some of the people in here to fight against like all of this money that oil and gas and coal lobbyists can throw around to further their goals of not doing anything about these issues?
Well, the panel before, you had great organizers and lobbyists are you from West Virginia?
Yes.
Yeah, well, who have a lot of experience, members of the legislature, he's gone, I guess, but no, there he is, who can advise you about how to go with this. I got my start as an organizer, It's like, put people together, put them behind a goal, and show up. I don't think there's a magic solution that I can articulate in a couple sentences, but I would say get in it, learn it, start talking about it, and figure out things you might do locally. Could be an op-ed, could be a meeting with a mayor, could be any number of things to get off the ground, and no doubt can lead to, here we have it. Here's a big, huge question facing West Virginia and the country. These data centers, they're mostly, right, coal and gas, right? This is an industry that's growing rapidly, and yet they're using coal-fired and gas-fired electricity in a time when I showed you that curve, when we're in deep, deep trouble with our carbon emissions. So, anyway, what was the word? Don't mourn, organize. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Okay, you got it? Okay. Lunchtime, right?